In 1725, a village in Serbia claimed that the dead had risen. The priest wrote what he saw in the official report. A corpse, fresh as the day it was buried. Blood still wet at the lips. The villagers said his name was Peter Blagojevich. History called him something else. The first real vampire. Long before anyone whispered the name Dracula, Europe already feared the dead. In the small villages of the Balkans, where fog settled like breath over the earth, death was not an ending. It was a question. People buried their loved ones in shallow graves, sometimes too soon, because life and death often blurred together. Disease spread fast, and fear spread even faster. When a villager died suddenly, others soon followed. The survivors began to dig, and what they found convinced them that something beneath the soil was still alive. Bodies that looked fresh. Blood at the mouth. Fingernails that seemed longer than before. The skin flushed red with the color of life. They didn't know that this was what corpses do as gases build and skin tightens. They only saw proof of what they already feared, that the dead were not resting. They called them yupa, or vampire, words that crawled from the Slavic tongue into every other language of Europe. A creature that fed on its own village. A shadow of the human soul that refused to let go. And so began the oldest fear of all. The fear of what will not stay dead. Across Eastern Europe, each region had its own way of fighting what they could not see. In Poland, the suspected vampire was buried face down, so that if he woke, he would dig deeper, not upward. In Bulgaria, they placed thorns, stones, or bricks in the corpse's mouth to keep it from biting through the grave cloth. In Serbia, villagers drove stakes through the chest, sometimes the heart, sometimes the stomach, believing it pinned the spirit to the ground. And always, fire was the last resort. The smell of burning flesh in the night was not seen as horror. It was safety. These weren't rituals of cruelty. They were acts of protection. Communities desperate to control something unstoppable. Death that refused to behave. The church tried to explain it away, to label it heresy, to call these fears pagan relics of older gods. But the people didn't care for theology. They cared for the sound of their children coughing in the dark. When livestock died, when a baby turned pale overnight, when blood pooled where it shouldn't, the living did what they had to. They opened the graves. And in those moments, horror became habit. A tradition passed from hand to hand, from shovel to stake. By the early 18th century, Europe believed itself enlightened. Science bloomed, reason ruled. But in the dark soil of rural Austria, Hungary, and Serbia, the old beliefs never died. Between 1725 and 1732, a wave of documented vampire cases swept through the Habsburg Empire. These were not legends whispered around the fire. They were recorded, investigated, and written down by imperial officers. The first was Peter Blagojevich, a farmer from a Serbian village under Austrian rule. 9 days after his death, 9 villagers died in quick succession. Each, it was said, after claiming the dead man had visited them in their sleep. When his grave was opened, his body was undecayed, his mouth stained with blood. The local priest described it in an official report. The body was as one not dead, the hair, nails, and skin new grown. They drove a stake through his heart, and according to the witnesses, blood burst from the wound with a groan. The villagers burned the remains to ash. Only 5 years later, it happened again. This time in Medvedja, Serbia. The case of Arnold Pauli. Pauli had once told neighbors he had been attacked by a vampire near the Turkish border. He smeared himself with the creature's blood, believing it would protect him. When Pauli died suddenly, and others followed, the soldiers of the Austrian Empire investigated once more. They opened the graves, and again found bodies that had not rotted, with blood at the lips. The report concluded that vampirism was no idle superstition. The empire's doctors and generals signed their names. It was the first time the modern world admitted, in writing, that something beyond reason might still be stirring underground. Word of the Balkan cases reached Vienna, then London, then Paris. Pamphlets and newspapers carried the stories like contagion. Europe was both horrified and fascinated. The Enlightenment had promised reason, but superstition proved harder to kill than anyone expected. Doctors tried to explain the symptoms. Decomposition gases. Ruddy complexions caused by pressure under the skin. Blood at the mouth because of internal decay. But those were cold answers for a warm fear. For the families who had watched their dead rise, science offered no comfort. And so the vampire traveled from the graves of Serbia into the imagination of the West. German poets turned the horror into art. French romantics made it seductive. By the 19th century, the vampire had left the village behind and entered the parlor. No longer the rotting corpse that haunted peasants, but the aristocrat who drained the life of the living with charm and beauty. Lord Byron's Circle birthed the vampire in 1819. Then, decades later, Bram Stoker's Dracula gave the myth a new face. But beneath the velvet and candlelight, the same terror pulsed. The fear of what will not stay dead. Today, we no longer open graves. We open screens. The vampire has adapted again. To film, to books, to our collective imagination. But its roots remain in the soil of old Europe, where death was once a neighbor, not an idea. The ancient villagers believed in vampires because they needed to believe that death could be negotiated with. If the dead could rise, then maybe death wasn't final. Maybe there was still a way to fight it, to understand it, to name it. Every age gives the vampire a new mask. The plague carrier, the forbidden lover, the addict, the immortal dreamer. But beneath them all, it's the same hunger, a refusal to vanish. The vampire is not just a creature of night. It's the memory of our dead, knocking from under the ground, asking to be remembered. And perhaps that's why the myth never died. Because deep down, we share its secret. We too are afraid of being forgotten, of turning to dust without a trace. We too fear what will not stay dead.